right? And so when World War II broke out, MacArthur was famous for saying, "I shall return." No one really wanted him to. Um, but it was
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and today our episode is dealing with the Philippines, and it's in a way that is approachable and understandable, and it's an important one because the Philippines was one of the first, maybe the first major U.S. adventure as an imperialist country beyond the Western Hemisphere. And the history of the repression and the exploitation of the Philippines, as well as what's going on today, and we'll focus a lot on what's going on today, is very important. And American activists need to know about this. There's a vibrant movement led by Filipino Americans and immigrants from the Philippines here in the United States, and our guest today is the national chair of Bayan USA, Adrian Bonifacio, who does just a fabulous job. I mean, Adrian is an organizer, and that comes across because he uses the language of the people to explain what has been going on and what is going on in the Philippines. Adrian will give us a political analysis that takes into consideration the Philippines and the United States' place in geopolitics, but also looks at uses class struggle analysis, uses imperial analysis and the national question to actually dig into what's been going on and what's happening today. And our episode is about an hour, so it's a quick overview, but you'll come away with this understanding the basics of the Philippines and why Bayan and other people's movements in the Philippines are taking the approach that they are, and that they do make a lot of sense. So we hope you'll enjoy our episode today, and tell your friends about it. But here is the national chairperson of Bayan USA, Adrian Bonifacio. So welcome to Fight Back Radio, Adrian.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's great to have you. So you're the chairperson of Bayan USA, the national chairperson. So first, what is Bayan USA?
So Bayan USA is the largest overseas chapter of Bayan in the Philippines. Bayan is short for Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, which in Filipino means the New Patriotic Alliance. It was an alliance founded in 1985, really at the height of the dictatorship under Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And it sought to fight against that dictatorship, fight for people's democratic rights, and has continued ever since then, since the Filipino people's struggle for sovereignty, for democracy hasn't finished. And so we know that Filipinos are in over 200 countries around the world, including over 4 million here in the United States. And so there is a formation of Bayan here in the United States ever since we launched in 2005.
Okay, so it was initially a coalition of groups in the Philippines to deal with internal domestic issues, but because so many Filipinos have emigrated from the Philippines to the United States and other countries around the world, you've started to start chapters in other places. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And, linking it back to the formation of Bayan under the Marcos dictatorship, it is really under Ferdinand Marcos Sr. that you saw a mass exodus of Filipino workers from the country because of the policies he set up. So it's in that legacy too that Bayan USA is operating.
Well, let's talk about that a second. So what were the policies that he set up that led to this immigration?
Yeah, so some of the biggest ones, and we put it under this umbrella term called the labor export policy. And the labor export policy was basically a set of policies, a set of government agencies that the Marcos regime instituted to export people abroad. And that was to cover the massive amounts of debt repayment that he was having to pay as a result of lots of loans from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. And then also the the billions that he stole from the Filipino people in corrupted funds.
Wow. So so how, okay, so yeah, I mean, so how did so people left just because economically they couldn't afford it any longer? Is that the deal, or this is an arrangement that was made with the old dictator Marcos in the the 80s or whenever to try to placate whatever the imperial interests in the United States and other countries?
Yeah, it's definitely both. I mean, the US played a big role in, quote unquote, welcoming Filipino labor into the country. Workers, professionals, and the Marcos regime at the time really tailored even the entire education industry to creating colleges to train people for work abroad. And then, like I mentioned before, institutionalizing government agencies to do so. So that today is consolidated into what the Philippines calls the Department of Migrant Workers, which is relatively new under the most previous president, Duterte, stood it up. But that just goes to show that long legacy of, failed government attempts to address economic crisis and poverty caused by their own doing.
I want to circle back to this, but before we do, I wanted to maybe just give a little bit of history of the relationship between the United States and the Philippines. And as I was thinking about us getting together to talk about this, I was thinking about what I was taught in high school about the Spanish-American War, and which was 1898 was a landmark year for the Philippines. But what we were taught was and maybe maybe you as well, because you're from the United States, but it was this war with Spain over largely the about Cuba and this San Juan Hill and Teddy Roosevelt and all this sort of stuff. And I remember even as a high school student being confused. There was a warship that the Spanish actually was rigged, but there was the Maine, it was called, was allegedly bombed, and so the U.S. was mad at Spain, and they were treating the Cubans bad, and then they invaded the Philippines. And I'm like, well, what? Why did the hell did they invade the Philippines if they were mad about what was going on in Cuba? Which Cuba is whatever. You can argue what the U.S.'s role should be there, and we do at times, but it's in close proximity to the United States. The Philippines really isn't. And so, I mean, could you talk a little bit from the point of view of somebody who knows about the Philippines? What was going on in the Philippines at that time, and why did the United States invade it at that time?
Yeah, those are also things that I was either taught or not taught in schools, right? Because the Philippines is very the coverage on Philippines in schools is very minimal, right? And wrong at that. And so to understand, maybe just to back up a bit, the Philippines had been colonized by Spain for hundreds of years, right? And not without a fight. The Filipino people always resisted the colonial rule, whether that was imposition of very violent means of religious subjugation, land theft, land grabbing, and the like, right? And so this was really coming to a head. By the time it was the late 1800s, there had been hundreds of years of resistance at that point already, right? And the Filipino people's organization as a people fighting back against Spanish rule reached greater levels. And so it was really in 1896 where we saw the startings of more nationwide revolution against Spanish colonization. And this was really led by many different people, but in terms of an armed resistance, there's a group called the Katipunan, led by figures like Adrian Bonifacio and others who led an armed struggle against Spanish colonization and won. That's the part that's really not talked about so much in history books. So
they had liberated themselves at this point.
Exactly, right. And of course, if you zoom out and look at the global context, we see Spain as a weakening colonial power. And that's where you have a rising superpower like the US come in, right? Who is trying to figure out where it can lay its stakes in the world in this new global order as Spain is on the downturn, right? And so in order to understand something like US imperialism and the rise of US imperialism in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, it's crucial to understand what happened in the Philippines, because really the Philippines was part of the US's first imperialist wars abroad, right? And so as the Filipino people won their revolution against Spain, the US came in, right? And all those things that you mentioned about fake battles, backroom deals made to basically sell off the Philippines to the US were what ensued. And the Filipino people didn't just, concede to a new colonial or imperial master. 1898 also marked the beginning of what we call the Philippine-American War.
So, then we move into from the 19th century to the 20th century, and my high school teachers didn't tell me too much about what was going on during those times. The next time the Philippines come on our radar, at least for my high school, was in World War II, when there was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Asia got a certain focus from the United States, and the Japanese occupied many countries, but including the Philippines. And there's this famous quote from General MacArthur, "I shall return." And the idea of what we were taught was that the Japanese were, occupying, and of course they were. It was an imperialist country as well.
Right.
But that somehow if U.S. imperialism was freedom and liberty, and so could you and feel free to go back into my ignorance from the early part of the 20th century if there's anything you want to raise. But how do you look at that also that time of Japanese occupation in the U.S. going back and forth, and what was actually going on then was I'm doubting that MacArthur actually liberated the Filipinos.
Right. And so before World War II broke out, the Philippines had so the Philippine-American War began in around 1898, and usually historians will say it ended around 1902 or so. It lasted for much longer. People continued to fight even past what formal textbooks might say, and it was really a genocide of people. There's not the best records of counts of people murdered at that time, but lowball estimates, upwards of 200,000, even up to over 1 million Filipinos were massacred in really brutal ways. I mean, this is where the US tested a lot of different forms of torture, of warfare that it would use in other imperialist wars elsewhere. And so it colonized the Philippines. The US colonized the Philippines. It set up different government structures that were supposed to have this air of what might be referred to as this benevolent assimilation, right? But very tinged with, of course, racism, class oppression, right? The US government really doubled down on the Filipino workers movement, which was growing really exponentially at the time. And then that lasted several decades of US colonization, imperial influence in terms of our culture, in terms of the economy, politics, of course, the military. And so by the time that World War II broke out, the US had been pretty entrenched in the country. That being said, the resistance against US imperial rule continued even through that. And so we have organizations like the Communist Party of the Philippines forming in the 30s, which was resisting US rule and later Japanese imperial occupation, right? And so when World War II broke out, MacArthur was famous for saying, "I shall return." No one really wanted him to. But it was a mess. I mean, the United States had its armed troops in the Philippines. It was a regiment called the United States Armed Forces of the Far East, and they really did not do anything to protect the most vulnerable Filipinos at the time. There's even reports of them fleeing Manila, going to the provinces, going to the countryside, and kind of carving out their own small kingdoms just to be safe and save themselves. It was really another Filipino People's Army, formed by the Communist Party actually at the time, called the People's Army Against Japan. There's an acronym called Hukbalahap, or the Hooks is the name for it. And so they continued to fight Japanese occupation all throughout. And when the US finally came back, it was not in a way that would ensure that the Filipino people's interests and their own liberation and democracy is at the center. And we see that especially because the US, it ravaged Manila with bombs. They really dropped so many bombs on Manila. It was one of the most destroyed cities during World War II, even compared to some cities
I didn't
Europe.
know that. I did not know that.
And so, the US came back to a very ravaged Philippines. It was easy for them to kind of reassume control because of that, especially in Manila, where the seat of power was. And it was not a great return of the US for the Filipino people.
Yeah, this is a story I think that's not very well known, and hopefully we're whetting the appetite of some of our Fight Back Radio listeners to go dig more into this. We're not obviously not covering Filipino history, but I wanted to give a little bit of background into some of it. It was interesting as you were talking a lot. The communist resistance in the Philippines during World War II. That happened in many of the occupied countries that were occupied by Italy or Germany as well. And I didn't know that about the Philippines, that it happened that way. And similarly, the US or England or somebody came in and invaded, just like MacArthur did in the Philippines, to take over after the people had liberated themselves. So that's a terrible situation. But so then we're zooming through history. If you want to recommend something for people to read, that would be appropriate too. But I wanted to get into after World War II, you have here in the United States the McCarthy days, and you have national, internationally there's a polarization of the world between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that influenced pretty much every country in the world in some way or another. And I know there was different deal makings, and maybe I don't know all of what happened in the Philippines, but eventually Ferdinand Marcos comes to power as a strong man who's going to support the United States and smash the communists. And at least, again, this is my high school knowledge of what happened. Maybe if you could comment on a little bit what really happened there and how that happened. And again, if you do have a recommendation of something for people to go to that are interested in this, we can put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, one book that is really an essential read to know about Philippine history is called Philippine Society and Revolution by Amado Guerrero. And so a lot of what Bayan, how we analyze is also contained in that text. So would definitely encourage folks who are interested in learning more about Philippine history to check that book out. But to go back to your question about the Marcos dictatorship, the first Marcos, right? Because we're living under the second one right now.
Unfortunately, yes.
Unfortunately. So the Philippines is granted nominal independence. And what we mean by that is that we don't really view the Philippines as free, even though it's not a formal colony. And that's because US imperialism continues to maintain a chokehold over our economy, the politics, our culture, so on and so forth. And so we view the Philippines really as a semi-colony or a neo-colony. And after that independence was granted in 1946, there ensued a series of regimes that were pretty subservient to US interests. And so by the time that Marcos Sr. was elected into presidency, he just continued that trend, right? And I keep mentioning that the resistance continues to go on despite all of these different twists and turns in history, right? And if we look at Philippine history, we should really understand that, like many other people's histories, it's a history of struggle, of class struggle, and of revolution. And so under the Marcos Sr. Regime, right, before it declared open dictatorship, there was a burgeoning people's movement, which was kind of revitalized a lot by the, it's my cat, a lot by the, you might hear him later.
Okay.
But a burgeoning people's movement really spearheaded by the youth, right? There's also a militant trade unionist movement, and those two kind of linked together in the cities, right? Some important organizations that were formed during this period were the Patriotic Youth, or Kabataang Makabayan, which was founded by Jose Maria Sison, who recently passed last December, a great Filipino revolutionary. And later on, he went to refound and reestablish the Communist Party of the Philippines, which before 1968, before the reestablishment, had some challenges with its own internal work, right? And so the Communist Party was reestablished in 1968, and the resumption of an earnest armed revolution against the reactionary Filipino government began in 1969, when the New People's Army, the Revolutionary Army, was founded. And so that was kind of the context of Marcos's iron fist rule, right? As these things were developing, as the people's movement grew in the cities, and then as it expanded like wildfire in the countryside, right? Marcos declared martial law in 1972, and that began more than a decade of some of the most violent fascist attacks the Filipino people have seen.
So, and I remember some of this because my life has been mostly in the labor movement here in the United States, but in the 1980s especially, I remember there was a Filipino Worker Support Committee, and
right.
There was certain work that we did aligned with a federation called the KMU, which
yes.
I don't know I know it stands for May 1st movement in the translation, because here in Chicago, we're proud of the Haymarket martyrs and the people that fought for the 8-hour day and created the May 1st, May Day incident. But the KMU has a plaque on the monument here in Chicago to the martyrs of that. And but there was lots of this resistance. I remember, and I want to ask you a little bit about the resistance to the U.S. military, because there was two bases, if I remember correctly, Clark Air Force Base and the Subic Naval Base, and there was a lot of work was done, to expose that there was the role the U.S. was playing there. There was increased by the occupation of those areas of prostitution, other things, and abuses of the local people in those areas. But also, this militarization of the country had an effect on people, not just the bases themselves. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that the Philippines had been granted independence, quote unquote, in 1946. But one of the key ways that the US maintained its grip over the Philippines were those bases, right? And the different unequal military agreements that were set up in the following years. So you have Clark and Subic as two major bases of the US. You have agreements between the two countries, like the Mutual Defense Treaty, which is a big one, and many others in succeeding years. But like you mentioned, these bases were sites of really terrible violence against women, violence against trans people, violence against children, environmental degradation, attacks against indigenous people, and land theft. And so there's been a very violent history of U.S. militarism in the Philippines. And because of that, it was, again, a people's movement. And a big campaign that Bayan in the Philippines actually helped to spearhead was to kick US bases out of the Philippines. And so because of such successful campaign work exposing the dangers of US militarism in the Philippines, in 1991, the Philippine Senate was basically pushed by the people to not ratify the base agreement anymore. And so by 92, the bases were closed down, but we know that the US wouldn't give up the fight that easily. So even after the bases were formally shut down and banned from the Constitution, there were different military agreements that were signed that allowed what we call a rotational presence of US troops. So a group of US troops comes in, and before they rotate out, a new one comes in. So it's de facto basing, right? And those are under things like the Visiting Forces Agreement. And even in 2014, the Obama presidency kind of passed a new agreement called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which basically makes the entire Philippines a base for the US, because the US can preposition troops, supplies, and so on at any the provisions just say agreed location. So it could really be anywhere in the Philippines. And so even after that struggle against US bases, which is, a success, there's still a lot more work to do in terms of campaigning against US basing and militarism in the Philippines.
Yeah, no, it's well, first my hat's off to your movement. If you pointed out through this whole episode so far, there's the struggle of the Filipino people has been valiant, and I'm sure it's had ups and downs, but it's been persistent, and
Right.
and that is a great victory that you won at that time to get the bases off, even if they didn't completely remove them. And whatever your enemies and our enemies, they don't sleep.
Right.
They're persistent, and we must be persistent and vigilant too.
Right.
So I think I suspect, especially with the ramping up of hostilities between the U.S. and China, that the Philippines its geography becomes more important to the United States probably as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about how the resistance is looking like, either here in the United States or in the Philippines, and what things, what should people be demanding of the, here of the U.S. Government to not do, I suppose, and what kinds of things are people doing in the Philippines?
Yeah, so particularly around U.S. militarism, these past year or so has been a really critical moment to build up the anti-militarist fight of the Filipino people and folks in solidarity with the Filipino people. There have been many different state visits of U.S. officials to the Philippines. Kamala Harris went to the Philippines. The Secretary of State also visited. When Marcos was here last September, he met with Biden. And a lot of the content of these meetings has been to firm up further military presence in the Philippines. So in February of this year, the Philippine government announced 4 new de facto bases to be used by the US. And so this is under that Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement I had been talking about, where it's just any agreed location. So previously, there were 5 agreed locations. They added 4 to make the total 9.
Wow.
After that, and I should mention that these 4 new locations are basically are located in provinces close to Taiwan, and then bordering the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. So it's very obvious what they're trying to do. After February, there was a series of military exercises too between the Philippines and the US, including the largest ever. There's a military exercise in the Philippines called Balikatan. It means shoulder to shoulder, and it's between the US and the Philippines. 2023 was the largest Balikatan exercise in history. There were over 12,000 US troops that came to train with Philippine soldiers. And some of the exercises were what they call live fire, meaning the use of actual rockets. And one of the exercises that they did was to sink a decommissioned ship in the South China Sea. And so it's pretty obvious the war provocation that's happening. So you have these 9 bases, you have these military exercises. Marcos just finished a visit to the US not too long ago in Washington, D.C. And from those meetings, there's even more laid out, like a security assistance roadmap, meaning what is the military aid, the military equipment that the US will provide the Philippines in the next 5 to 10 years. They established new, bilateral defense guidelines. So, our campaign against US militarism in the Philippines and the Asia Pacific in general is really ramping up. And so, one concrete way that people in the United States can help, in addition to joining us on the streets, joining us in our mass movement work, is there is a bill in the House right now called the Philippine Human Rights Act. And it is a bill launched by very close allies that Bayan works with to cut U.S. security assistance to the Philippines until such a time that human rights are ensured, because the U.S. military trains the Philippine military and funds it, and that Philippine military is notorious for very fascist attacks against the people. So cutting U.S. support in any way for fascism in the Philippines, including the way that the U.S. military supports it, is a huge help.
Okay, no, that's good, and we'll hopefully we'll put your contact info in the show notes so people can get a hold of Bayan, and if there's anything people can do to support that House resolution, we can put that there as well. I wanted to ask you also, so Marcos, the Marcos Jr., the new Marcos, right. Only recently won the election, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the elections in the Philippines, because it seemed to me that the movement had hope for if there had been fair elections, they'd put more resources, and correct me if I'm wrong, than in the past, and there was irregularities in the election and whatever. I mean it seems like this Marcos is, well, even the Duterte who was there before him,
right.
These are people who were not expanding even bourgeois democratic rights, but were repressive.
Right.
So I mean, how do you view elections as a process or a possibility for change in the Philippines?
Yeah, elections is one avenue of struggle for Bayan. And we aren't against things like reform or having a say or analysis in elections. We view elections as a way to also promote, right? What are people's demands? What are the people really wanting to see in government, right? And it is a way that we can also expand the mass movement for change. We can also promote what we view as national democrats, which I should explain what we mean by national democracy in a bit. But we can explain what our program is for change in the Philippines. And we also do it because we also engage in them because there's a stake, right? When the ruling classes, when the ruling elite are vying for power, the people have to also participate in that struggle so that we're not just trampled on, right? And the last election, you mentioned that there were a lot of resources put into it, from the people's movement to the electoral parties themselves. I think an important contextual point for the 2022 Philippine elections was that you really had the consolidation of some of the most fascist, vile ruling dynasties in the Philippines come together to steal the highest seat of power in government. So of course the Marcoses were there, right, who had been exiled from the Philippines, right, after people power. In fact, Marcos Jr. couldn't even step foot inside the United States because of an ongoing contempt order that they didn't pay reparations for martial law victims, right? So the fact that he's able to step inside the US now is just because of diplomatic immunity.
It's incredible, yeah.
Yeah, and if folks don't know, Marcos's running mate, in the Philippines, the president and vice president aren't elected together. It's actually two separate elections. But the person running for vice president, in line with Marcos, was Sara Duterte, the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, right? And so you have the children of fascists running together in the same slate. And so, as a policy of building a united front against some of the worst representatives of fascism in history, of course, the People's Movement has to participate and take a stand. And so here in the US, we're out here, Bayan doesn't endorse political candidates, right, for president at all, but we're here exposing the crimes against the people that both the Marcos and Duterte regimes were responsible for, and also promoting, progressive lawmakers for, let's say, Senate or the House, which would take another long discussion about how the Philippine House of Representatives is structured and how they try to allow marginalized representation in it. But it was a really important fight. And I think the most important thing is that the election wasn't the only avenue of fight that Bayan and other activists were engaging in. We're still there in the streets. We're still doing our mass movement work. It was an intense fight, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, I want to give you a chance here too to talk about national democracy and what does that mean for Bayan, and is that a goal is that the goal that you have? And so can you talk a little bit about what's more specifically, what does that mean?
Yeah, so it's a good thing we went over Philippine history, because it kind of gives a sense of what really are the problems that people are facing, right? And in building any movement, I should say, we need to have a good analysis of what are the things that we're fighting against and what are the things we're fighting for, right? And so if we take a step back and look at Philippine society, the long history of it, for Bayan as national democratic activists, we view that there are three root problems facing the Filipino people. One of them is imperialism, specifically US imperialism, right? And I think we've talked a lot about the ways that the US has maintained its grip over the Philippines. Another root problem is feudalism. And so, people might have this perception of, medieval times or something like that. But what we mean by feudalism is a struggle between those who are owning the land and those who are working the land and have no right to it, right? So the Philippines is largely an agrarian society. 75% of the population are still peasant farmers working the land. They don't have the right to it. And the land is owned by a very small number of people, like less than 1% of big landlords, who are most often also people who are running big businesses or are in government itself, right? And so feudalism is a huge problem. And the third root problem we see is when the government bureaucracy is basically run like a business for profit of the ruling elite in power. And we call that bureaucrat capitalism. So capitalism entrenched in the bureaucracy, right? And so because of these three problems that all intersect and build off of each other, it really defines and shapes Philippine society. And the way that we view Philippine society is semi-colonial, right? Which I mentioned before, that it is not an official colony, but for all intents and purposes, US imperialism dominates, right? And the other way we characterize it is semi-feudal, meaning to say that there is a really deeply entrenched feudal mode of production or way of producing things all across the Philippine countryside. It's just that this production is now serving an imperialist global market, right? So it's not quite like 100% feudalism that you might have seen during medieval times, but it's really entrenched in the world system we have today, right? And so, okay, the Philippines is semi-colonial and semi-feudal. So what does that mean for us fighting, right? It means that we need to fight for sovereignty, right? We need to fight for true liberation, national sovereignty, and we need to fight for democratic rights, most especially the democratic right to land that's not afforded to a majority of people, right? And so when we say we're national democratic activists, it's because we're fighting for just that, national sovereignty and genuine democracy in the Philippines. So that's national democracy. And, just to add on a little bit, you asked if that's the ultimate goal. We don't stop there. We are fighting a national democratic movement with a socialist perspective. We do not want the Philippines to develop and have freedom and democratic rights only to become some kind of capitalist superpower that will just entrench class exploitation and oppression. But we're actively trying to sow the seeds of socialist society in the Philippines as we are fighting for national democracy.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's helpful. That gives some vision to our Fight Back Radio listeners to when they hear about things in the Philippines and about the resistance, what their goals actually are and what they're trying to do and why. And so I appreciate that. I know. Let me go back to the new Marcos who just came to the United States not that long ago, and he was he met with Biden, etc. How do you view and I know actually also there's going to be the Asian Pacific what do they call it, APEC, Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation right. Conference, which is coming up in November in San Francisco, I think. Could you talk a little bit about what was Marcos? He was allowed into the country because he's the president of the Philippines. Now you just told us, but what was he doing here? What happened when what was that all about?
So this was Marcos's first official state visit to Washington, D.C. I already mentioned a little bit about some of the military deals that he brokered with the United States. Speaking a little bit more about the economic side of things, right? We know that imperialism has imperialism has many faces, but two of the very prominent ones are its military, apparatus, and also its economic apparatus that is exploiting workers and labor around the world, right? And so some of the things that were signed between Marcos and Biden are basically further entrenching neoliberal policies into the Philippines. There was what is named US-Philippines Trade and Investment Framework Agreement was signed or announced between the two leaders. Biden also announced a U.S. trade and investment mission to the Philippines, which is basically, you can think of who are all the big capitalists in the U.S. going to the Philippines to figure out where to invest in, right? And a lot of these are under the guise of buzzwords like green technology, things for healthcare, right? But what this is really masking is that, Marcos, for example, green technology, right? Inviting more foreign investment into the country will really benefit, let's say, US-based mining corporations who can extract things like nickel, cobalt, copper, and so on that are used for lithium batteries at the expense of the Filipino people, right? Instead of creating national industry that can mine things sustainably, even create industry for, let's say, battery production in the Philippines. It's inviting foreign corporations to extract wealth and for the benefit of the US capitalists, right? And so these were some of the trade or economic things that were brokered in addition to the military. So you kind of have them running parallel with each other, right? And the reason why that's important is because oftentimes when you have very exploitative economic practices, foreign investment, foreign mining, let's say, in the Philippines, it results in land grabbing. It results in attacks on peasant and indigenous communities, and they fight back, right? These are in places where the revolution is the strongest. And so the Philippines needs to also supplant these economic deals with military ones so that it can have more aid in repressing people's movements that are trying to fight against economic exploitation in the country. And so, those are some of the big things that Marcos accomplished in this mission to the US. We wrote an analysis statement that you can find on our website or our socials too, that have a lot more details on the specific names of things as well.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Let me. I want to go back to some of the repression in the Philippines, you've mentioned Marcos and Duterte as a fascist. Also, I one of our Fight Back news writers was in the Philippines recently, and
right.
And they were there's something called red tagging, and he was red tagged Joe Osbaker, and I hadn't heard that word before, but could you tell our Fight Back Radio listeners what is red tagging and how do they use that in the Philippines to try to fight, to try to undermine our movement?
Yeah, so red tagging is basically red baiting, right? A very McCarthyist tactic of labeling someone communist, which is a very big, bogeyman in the Philippines. The phrase that the Philippine government will use is like a communist terrorist, right? And automatically link communism with terrorism. And so red tagging is a practice that criminalizes activism. It is used to try to sway public opinion away from the justness of waging revolution, right? And also to try to scare people, right? But more than that, red tagging, so, practically how it works is that organizations, individuals will be labeled as communist terrorists, right? And this invites harassment and potentially even physical attack or assassination, right? And so there have been many activists in the Philippines who are legal activists. They're not taking up arms against the government. They are organizing people, according to all the stipulations of reactionary law, right? But yet they are still targeted and attacked, right? There are many examples of even US-based activists facing red tagging. Of course, many people in Bayan have been red tagged. Bayan as a whole organization, Bayan USA, has been red tagged. A famous case happened in 2019 of an activist named Brandon Lee, who organized with one of Bayan's member organizations when he was in San Francisco. He went on to serve peasant and indigenous communities in the Cordillera region of the Philippines. He experienced red tagging and harassment for several years. And then one day, the Philippine military tried to take his life. And so there was an assassination attempt on Brandon's life. He was, thankfully he survived the attack. We were able to launch a successful people's campaign to fly him back to the US, where he continues to organize, right? But because of that attack, he is paralyzed from the chest down, right? And that's when Brandon speaks.
Horrible. Oh,
yeah. And he recently spoke at one of our national assemblies and said that he's going to continue fighting, and especially knowing that a lot of people don't make it out, right? And so red tagging is, might seem like just, it's just something that happens and people, it's just like labeling, but it really leads to physical violence, right? And all the more now that red tagging is more institutionalized by the Philippine government through things like the anti-terror law, which was passed in 2020, or agencies like there's a notorious one called the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. Very long name, but very notorious for tagging people, putting people on terror lists, it's just a rampant practice.
No, it's terrible. It's terrible. I want to ask you. I want to pivot a little bit to Bayan USA is based in the United States, of course, and so you're organizing people across this country, but a lot of the people that you've talked earlier about the older Marcos and the emigration of so much labor, but like many people that come to the United States from other countries, there's issues that that come up. Could you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that you have, either immigrant rights or worker issues that come up that you guys deal with in Bayan?
Yeah, so like other people in the working class, part of oppressed nationalities, Filipinos don't have it easy here in the United States, of course, right? And it's kind of doubled down by the exploitation and oppression they and their families face back home in the Philippines. The Filipino American community in the US is a very it's always in flux, right? And partly because of the massive migration of Filipinos out of the country to the US, it happens on a daily basis, right? Some of Filipinos, when they're here, are brought here through trafficking, right? Labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and so on. Even through various quote unquote legal avenues or visas. We had one campaign during the pandemic for J1 workers. J1 is a cultural exchange visa. They usually bring young people to work in the US as a means of cultural exchange. And for a lot of Filipinos who are working in the hospitality industry, in resorts, hotels, restaurants in them, once the pandemic hit and they all closed down, they were left without a job and thousands of dollars, US dollars in debt to pay. And so, we also view this as a form of basically labor trafficking. There is a lot of trafficking of, let's say, caregivers, right? There are some professionals who are trafficked as, let's say, teachers or nurses, and they come here and they find out that they don't actually have the job that they were promised. So immigrant issues are definitely something. Wage theft are huge campaigns that many of our migrant workers experience, right? They experience wage theft and we wage campaigns against it. Some other campaigns are around, police brutality against anti-Asian hate. And so, kind of any people's issues that the Filipino community faces here in the US, we also take on, of course, in solidarity with the many other people's organizations that are also facing these things here in the US.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've here in Chicago, I know we've seen contingents of Filipinos at many of the marches for immigrant rights and worker rights, and they're most, if not all of them, are one of the 30 organizations that are affiliated with Bayan, I suspect. So that's it's important. It's important to have this solidarity. As you were talking, I was thinking of the United Farm Workers Union here in the United States was actually people know Cesar Chavez and the fights to get farm worker rights in California and other places, but it was actually a coalition of Filipino and Mexican and Chicanos who fought for that, and it was whatever they had the national differences that our enemies try to create, but they were able to overcome them, and so That's another story. Some of our listeners can go check out.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time, and this has been a rich discussion. Is there anything that we haven't spoke about that you want to highlight? Things that are coming up from your organization that you might want to announce here?
Yeah, I can think of two things, and it felt like such a quick hour or so, right?
Yeah.
But I shared a lot about the National Democratic movement from Bayan's perspective, and was able to touch a little bit about the revolutionary armed struggle in the Philippines too. But I would really encourage all listeners, if you're trying to understand the Philippine movement for national democracy, to, of course, follow Bayan, participate, show solidarity in our campaigns, but also learn more about the revolution happening in the Philippines, which is one of the longest running civil wars happening in the Asia Pacific right now, and has really not backed down in the face of multiple fascist regimes and open dictatorship. So resources are definitely out there, and that book, Philippine Society and Revolution, is definitely a place to start. And the other thing I'd mention is that, in line with our campaigns, some of the big things we have coming up, specifically related to the economic side of things, is a campaign to say no to APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which again is, trading away people's livelihood and lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was some mobilizations actually that just happened in Detroit. There were trade ministerial meetings of APEC that happened. They're going to be meeting again in July, August timeframe in Seattle. We'll be there for that. And there's a huge leader summit in San Francisco in November. And so together with our allies in the International League for People's Struggles, and also a broader coalition, a No to APEC coalition, we'll be staging a counter summit and a protest around it. So please keep on the lookout for that, and you could definitely put some details on how to get involved in the show notes or anything.
Yeah, no, I will. But as you were speaking, I realized I was remiss. I should have asked you a little bit about the DC4 and what's going on with that, and we can take a few minutes here to do that. If you could talk about who they are and what happened and what people could do to potentially support them, if there's anything.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked. And so, in line with all the issues that I just mentioned, when Marcos was visiting the US, we basically protested him at every turn. And one of those actions was at a very lavish dinner that Marcos, former President Gloria Arroyo, who is also a notorious person, and some of the richest Filipino billionaires, right, were there wining and dining while the Filipino people are suffering, right? The everyday person is suffering. And so we had 4 members bravely stage a civil disobedience at the restaurant that they were eating at, highlighting the people's issues, and they were arrested. So we called to free the DC4. We're calling for justice for the DC4 and to drop the charges, and really highlighting that the real criminals are Marcos and his cronies, right? Not 4 activists who are speaking truth to power, who are really on the people's side. And so they have an arraignment happening on May 23rd. So if this is showing after that, then we can definitely share ways to continue supporting their campaign, depending on what the outcome of that arraignment is. But people can definitely share the word about the DC4. We have some posts on our social media accounts, and you can also donate to our campaign work to support the legal defense funds for the DC4. So our link for that, which I can share too, but it's bit.ly/no-Marcos-visit.
Oh, that's a good link.
Yeah.
Yes, and we'll put all of that in the show notes too. Thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you so much for being our guest on Fight Back Radio. This was very informative. I thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you for having me anytime.
Okay, that was Adrian Bonifacio. And I encourage people that are interested in learning more about the Philippines, and hopefully that's a number of our Fight Back Radio listeners out there, to pick up the book that Adrian spoke about. It's called, Philippine Society and Revolution by Armando Guerrero. And so I think that's an important piece. Thank you so much, Adrian, for sharing that with us. And it gives a context to the role that the United States has played in the Philippines, and there's a similar story to so many countries, unfortunately. But our movements are linked. The movement of workers and oppressed people in the United States is linked to those workers and oppressed throughout the world, including the Philippines. And Bayan USA maybe sees that better than anybody else. I want to encourage people to go to Seattle later this summer, or if you're in the Seattle area, to check out what Bayan USA is doing there about the protests that are what should be occurring, and also in San Francisco, the protests that'll be there. So we want people to support our sisters and brothers in the Philippines, and their struggle is our struggle. So you're supporting yourself. It's solidarity. That's what it's all about. We'll put in the show notes how people can get the book I mentioned, also to support the DC4 and the contact information for Bayan. So we'll encourage you to go there and check that out. Finally, I want to encourage people to tell a friend about Fight Back Radio. We need to continue. We're growing at a steady clip, and we want to continue to do that. We appreciate those of you who are listening to us. If this is your first time listening to Fight Back Radio, go back and listen to some of the older episodes, or listen to ones in the future. But we want to expand this viewpoint and create discussion around important political issues that are out there. And this is all possible because of our production team of Dodd McColgan, Vince Olson, Shane Tremley, and Natalie Pranis. And for the entire Fight Back Radio team, I'm Richard Berg, saying until next time, all power to the people. But I thought it was good. I thought you did a great job, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry if I was a little rambly. I was trying to keep it short, but sometimes...
No, I thought you were good, because it's hard, because I'm asking you questions that, you could, and any one of those questions, I'm sure you could have went on for hours and hours about. It's like, okay, well, next question.
Yeah. In my head, I was like, okay, shut up, Adrian. It's time to let's move on.
Yeah, what's the first 50 years in the 20th century? Give me that in 3 minutes.
I know, right?